Welcome to our meeting on updates on the DC Women's History Museums and related sites. We have three wonderful presenters for you today. We have Julissa Marenco, who's the Assistant Secretary of Communications and External Affairs and the Chief Marketing Officer at the Smithsonian, and Julissa's also joined us a couple of years ago when we had another major presentation on the Women's History Museums in DC. So we're delighted to have you back, Julissa. Thanks. And we have Jennifer Herrera, who's the Vice President of the National Women's History Museum, which has existed since 1996. I don't know how long you've been with the museum, Jennifer, but you can fill us in on whatever details you like. And she's going to be telling us about some of the exciting things that the museum has done recently and big events that are occurring on March 30th and 31st at the museum at the Martin Luther King here in Washington, DC. And finally, we have our wonderful treasurer of the Clearinghouse on Women's Issues and a longtime NOW activist and other feminist activists in DC who actually got Senator Cardin to sponsor the ERA win, and Holly can fill us in on what the date was that she got him on board. And Holly's made many contributions and is a longtime interest in women's history and is going to fill us in on some of her views and favorite spots in the DC area. So that's our lineup. And unless there are any other questions at the beginning, I see lots of old friends. Welcome. And Julissa, would you like to start us off with information about happenings at the Smithsonian National American Women's History Museum?
Sure, I'm happy to. And let me just actually first just thank you, Sue, so much for having me again. I genuinely appreciate it. I enjoyed our meeting last time, and I think I have a little bit of kind of COVID fog brain. I think it was pre-pandemic, or maybe it was during the pandemic, but I do remember it being a virtual setting. So maybe it was during the pandemic, but it's great to be back here amongst you all today. Thank you so much for having me. So I thought maybe for purposes of today, maybe just by way of introduction, just in case there were some folks who I may not have engaged with last time in this setting. As Sue indicated, I serve as Assistant Secretary for Communications and External Affairs and Chief Marketing Officer for the institution. I have oversight of a couple of divisions within the institution. Of my oversight and of those divisions, quite a few of them are heavily invested and heavily involved in the development of the new museum. And as most folks might know, we're developing two museums. In addition to the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum, we're also developing the National Museum of the American Latino. So my teams across the board have been very heavily involved and engaged on these efforts. Also, as part of my responsibilities, I also serve as part of the senior leadership team. I report to Secretary Lonnie Bunch, but additionally, so I'm part of the leadership team that is navigating the new museums within the institution. So we have it's called New Museum Coordinating Committee, for lack of a better word, and MCC for lack of a better acronym. And this is the group that is coordinating all the efforts as it pertains to the two new museums across many, many different areas. And the members of this team are part of the senior leadership ranks of the Smithsonian. So we are heavily involved. I will tell you that the last 2 years since the legislation passed, we have been doing a lot. I'm looking forward to provide you an update, but I would kind of characterize, just important for folks to be aware, at the direction of the secretary, one of the things that he has asked of the senior leadership team as it pertains to the museums is to ensure that these museums are moving forward in a way that they are living and breathing currently, irrespective of not having a physical presence. And so what he means by that, as folks know, Secretary Lonnie Bunch built the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And from when the legislation was passed to when the actual museum was opened, it was about 13, 14 years. It was especially important to him that during that time, the museum existed, right? The museum was alive, meaning that the museum was active. He didn't want folks to look at the museum as kind of something in the distant future, but to him, it was especially important that both, not only were we building excitement for these museums, but that these museums were living, breathing, actionable organizations that were providing and telling stories about, in his case, African American history, in this case, women's history. So just by way of table setting, I thought I would start just by sharing that because it's kind of where we are for both of these museums. For both of these museums, we're very much in a place where we're kind of moving forward in many different areas, as I'll share some of our recent successes, centered around that idea and that thought. These are active living organizations that continue to develop, right, in march to a future physical presence. So as some of you all might know, one of our first orders from Congress when establishing the museum was to establish an advisory board for the museum. And we were directed to do that within 6 months of establishing the museum, which we did. So we have a 25-member advisory board, of which that advisory board includes 2 members of Congress, as well as individuals from all different walks of life, if you will, and interest. We also have serving on that board one of the members of our Board of Regents, so the Smithsonian Board of Regents also serves on this board as kind of the liaison between the 2 boards. And that's Ambassador Barbara Barrett, for folks that may be familiar with her or not. She's the former Secretary of the Air Force. And so this board, this council actually, has been extremely, extremely active from day one. We actually feel very, very lucky because they've been really engaged, enthusiastic, really pushing forward to move the museum forward. And one of those areas, you might have seen a recent article in the New York Times by way of an update. One of the areas that this board has been significantly active on has been in our fundraising efforts for these museums. Again, kind of looking at it through the lens of we are going forth, how are we building these museums? You may have seen recently in the New York Times, we actually purposefully aligned it with Women's History Month, our announcement of our success in fundraising to date. So since the museums have been established a little bit under 2 years, we've raised over $55 million specifically for the Women's History Museum. We have similar numbers for the National Museum of the American Latino. And that really has been buttressed by the council, by the Smithsonian, but I would argue also by just the sheer interest and enthusiasm that we have from folks across the country, organizations, companies, organizations, and individuals that are interested in ensuring that this museum is built, but also interested in the subject matter and in the Smithsonian's ability to be able to advance the understanding of women's contributions through American history and be able to create this special museum. So that, to us, folks might be aware, might not be aware, as part of us building the museum, when Congress enacted the legislation, as part of the legislation, Congress directed the Smithsonian to raise 50% of the totality of the funding for the museum. Congress would put the other 50%. So we're in a good place. I would argue, come 2 years out of the kind of from our start to be at 55 million, really, really strong presence. Congress is obviously happy with us. It definitely shows momentum for us. It's definitely helping us to have greater conversations. It actually has been very, very helpful to have both museums, because as you can imagine, a company or an organization that's interested in one, we're able to have conversations about both, right? Both representation within 2 groups. So I think it's been to the benefit of the museum. And again, I'm really appreciative to our council because they've really stepped up to the plate to ensure that we're opening doors, we're having conversations, and it's allowed us to get to this 55 million goal in a short period of time. From a kind of along the same lines of how do we ensure that this museum is alive and well, one of the things that we've been focused on of recent as part of ensuring that it's an active participating organization has been our presence on digital. Some of you all might have seen just recently we launched our social media accounts. This was very intentional, very deliberate to kind of craft the personality, if you will, of the museums online via our social media and via our digital channels. I would make a plug and encourage you to follow us at SI American Women on Twitter, as well as Smithsonian Women on Facebook, where you can get updates about the museums, rich content, some of the storytelling that we're looking to translate into the museums. But we've focused heavily on building that presence online with our social media channels. Some of you may recall the precursor, if you will, to the museum was the American Women's History Initiative, which had a digital presence, which the American Women's History Initiative focused on bringing women's stories to the totality of the institution, to all of our different museums. We've transitioned that setting into the new museums, again, from a virtual perspective, again, focus with reaching audiences and bringing the museum to people where they are via our digital and via our social media channels. Also, most recently and most importantly, we just announced a new director for the museum. Some of you all may have seen Nancy Yao. She comes to us from the Museum of Chinese America out of New York, a nonprofit, really executive, tremendous experience. She's been serving in this capacity in New York for quite some time. It's interesting. She has an interesting story, if you will, that somewhat is analogous to some of the challenges that she will be taking on as our founding director. While at the Museum of Chinese America, if you're familiar with this museum in New York, unfortunately in January of 2020, the museum experienced a significant fire. And so she found herself at a time with no location, loss of collections, loss of objects, loss of an archive, and needing to fundraise, which sounds very familiar to a little bit of our needs right now. An impressive woman, impressive story, to hear her tell it and to hear how they've persevered and how the organization has moved forward, as well as how she's been able to fundraise for this museum and really bring it back to life to some degree, both digitally, virtually, but also in person. She's been very engaged since her announcement with us. We had a lengthy process in the search, in the national search, interviewed some amazing, fantastic candidates, and Nancy obviously rose to the top. In addition to her experience in working with museums, previously she was the director of the Yale China America Association, where she worked through Yale, with Yale. She's a Yale MBA. She has deep roots in that community. I think folks, as you meet her, will just be impressed by her savviness, her charisma, and just her kind of just get it done attitude. And so we're looking forward to her start date in June. It's important to know, as part, after the fire happened at her museum, the museum was designated as one of America's cultural treasures, and that's something that she worked on to get it out there to ensure preserving it. And so we look forward to her starting in June of 2023. And then the last topic prior to ending, I'll share a little bit of research of what we've found as it pertains to some of the research that we've been doing the last couple of months during this time to see how we could best serve audiences interested in this museum. But prior to that, and I welcome any questions on this, we are most certainly in the midst of trying to secure locations for not just the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum, but also the American Latino Museum. And so just by way of an update, so the Smithsonian concluded a site selection process that took nearly 2 years, late October last year. This was a little bit over an 18-month process where the Smithsonian assessed 27 locations in and around Washington, D.C., on or near the National Mall. We looked at different factors in those respective locations, from environmental impact, transportation, location, ability to acquire, proximity to the National Mall. Many different factors were weighted into looking at these locations. After quite an extensive analysis with an external architectural firm, the Smithsonian identified 2 optimal sites that we thought would be the best sites to be able to build 2 new world-class museums. You may be familiar, the 2 sites that we've identified as optimal one being referred to as the South Monument Site, which if you are in Washington, D.C., and if I'm the Washington Monument and the National Museum of African American History and Culture is here, the South Monument Site is here. And so that's one of the sites that we thought could be quite interesting, again, after our extensive analysis that we thought was optimal. The second site is what we're referring to as the Tidal Basin site. So again, if I'm the Washington Monument, African American Museum is here, South Monument is here, Tidal Basin is kind of parallel behind the South Monument site. We've done extensive analysis and really feel that these two sites could really serve as the best locations for these two new museums. Our next step now is obviously to work with Congress. We've been working with Congress since we announced our optimal sites to get their approval for these sites to be located where we think they're optimal sites. There are some folks that think there are other better sites. Kind of one of the things that I've been stating to many people, having been probably a little bit too much in it, there is no perfect site. Even our optimal sites have some challenges. There is no perfect site. We have looked at a lot of sites. And I kind of equate it to, you know, you're looking for a house, right? If you want the perfect house, even when you build it yourself, there's still some challenges that you might encounter. But irrespective of that, we continue to work with our congressional stakeholders, kind of taking them through our site selection process and also sharing why we believe these are the optimal sites and how we would really appreciate their support in being able to move these sites forward. It's important to note that the Smithsonian cannot designate those sites until we have Congress's approval. Just in the spirit of full disclosure and transparency, one of the challenges with the two optimal locations is that they're located in what's called the reserve. Some folks may be familiar with this. It's an area designated by the Commemorative Works Act as an area of no more building on or near the National Mall. This most certainly presents a challenge, and we most certainly have been in touch with our colleagues and our federal partners in the Department of Interior, National Park Service, most certainly engaged with them. We understand their challenges, they understand our challenges. It's quite an amicable relationship. But again, you know, our goal and our hope is that Congress will help us out there. So in closing, I thought I would just share a little bit of research as to what we have found, which I found fascinating. We've done a lot of studies in this meantime during the last 2 years, right? We did a lot of studies and a lot of focus groups to get to the two optimal sites, but we've also done a lot of studies with regards to just, you know, what do people want to see in a Smithsonian American Women's History Museum, and what are they feeling? What are they thinking? You know, we're happy to report that close to 75% of, you know, at least Smithsonian visitors have indicated their interest in going to an American Women's History Museum, and 9 out of 10 Americans believe in its importance, and they want to be able to see the museum achieve its goals to highlight and advance the understanding of women's contributions in various fields throughout America's history. I thought most of interest, one of the demographics that is the most interested in this museum, it's actually males that are fathers in wanting to take not just their daughters, but also take their sons to the museums, which I think kind of speaks to just how very special this museum will be. There's a lot of asks and hopes for the museum to be extremely technological, if you will. It's not lost on anyone that both of these museums will be probably the first new museums built in a post-pandemic world. And so there's obviously a lot of interest on what that translates to, from digital connectivity to innovative technologies and what that might look like. There's also a lot of interest in obviously social media and how sharing stories about women in their lives and the totality of their lives is especially important to reach people beyond Washington, D.C. and out across the country, but as well as the world. So I will pause there. I hope this is a helpful update. I'm more than happy to entertain your questions and welcome them. Thank you so much for having me again.
Terrific. Please show your hand or speak up if you have a question. Connie.
Yes, I'm wondering, I've noticed that every one of the Smithsonian museums has recently sent me sort of like a membership brochure with all different kinds of levels of membership and donations and things. Are you guys planning to do that also?
Yeah, for sure. It's actually one of the things that the Secretary speaks to quite a bit. If you read his book, you'll notice it's in the book, is the importance of membership. Again, one of our mandates across the institution beyond the museum actually is how do we reach people outside of Washington, D.C. that will never make it to the National Mall? And that being stated, membership is one of the key tenets of that. And so how do we reach these people and how do we engage them and ensure that we have their enthusiasm? And it most certainly will be through membership. Jill?
Thank you. And thank you for that presentation. Very informative. Quick question about how does an organization contact someone at the Women's Museum to find out how we could participate with presenting some kind of digital exhibit or hard copy something,
Sure. Sure.
anything.
We usually folks reach out to info@si.edu, but that's not specific to the museum. But I'm happy to share my email. Please feel free to send me anything. I'm happy to get it to the right people.
Super. So you'll put that in the chat then?
Will do. Sure, will do.
Thank you.
Hi, Denise.
Hi,
Nice to see you again.
nice to see you. I was wondering if you could take me behind the scenes a little bit in terms of the director search. It was a 3-year search, and I know you had a search firm. Sounds like you've selected someone as the founding director who's experienced at building challenging and museums, but not really connected with the women's community or women's history particularly. I was just wondering why this person with this background and not someone else who might have more of a direct experience in women's history museums. Thank you.
That's a fair question. So, we had an extensive search with many different candidates, a national search through the search firm, and there were kind of similar site selection. There's never a perfect candidate, right? The dream candidate. We all have ideas to what that candidate might particularly look. Nancy is quite an impressive person. She rose to the top of a very really quite impressive pool of candidates, I would argue. Specific to her experience with women's history, she's obviously not a women's history curator, if you will, but we found her experience in working with museums, in building something, her experience in the nonprofit sector, in governance, in board governance. She has quite a bit of extensive. This board will need to continue to be built. It's important for us to have these candidates. I think her operational, her ability to craft teams and build the teams necessary, and very important, just the same, her fundraising success. She had a lot of great ingredients. From a history perspective, as you can imagine, some of our museums have chief curators, chief historians. There's other positions that obviously will focus on that end, just the same, especially if a director doesn't come from that respective discipline, if you will. But we found her to be an outstanding candidate. Thank you.
I have a question. On the website and other things, you list that there's probably a dozen or so staff already at the museum. Could you tell us a little bit about their functions and what they do, and are they expected to remain when we get a physical museum?
Sure. The museum currently has 14 employees. Same thing as looking back at the African American History and Culture Museum. In the meantime, while we build a museum, we need people. We need people in the museum to be building it. As I mentioned, we're looking to ensure that the museums are active. So we have folks that are working in communications, our digital presence, our virtual presence, education, some of our content, some of our storytelling, looking to see what that potentially looks like. Advancement, fundraising is a significant. Obviously, we have the director and support for the director. But we have about 14 positions right now that are filled, centered around those areas.
And are some of these people expected to stay on throughout? Are they long-time positions or short-time?
Yeah, they're long time. I don't know if the individuals will stay the whole time. It's hard for me to predict. But yeah, they're long-time positions, long-term positions for the museum.
And is there any particular guidance from the Smithsonian on how you treat controversial feminist issues? I know you had a girls exhibit. What kinds of guidelines do you have for things like that?
Sure. Maybe not so much by way of guidelines per se, but it's important to note that, you know, at the Smithsonian, we are deeply rooted in scholarship, right? And so our goal and our approach is based on the scholarship and deeply rooted in that. By way, and we recognize there's differences of opinions. We recognize that folks might look at things differently by way of their perspective, by way of their lived experiences. But our goal in the end as a trusted source is to be based in scholarship, based and rooted in scholarship.
Other folks have questions, comments?
I do a little. I've been thinking about this so much because of this program that I just wanted to ask you, how much do you think that the lack of equality in our history affects what's in the museum? Meaning, would there be less of a need for a women's history museum had we had full equality from the inception of our country? I just wonder how that factors into the decision making. And do you talk about when women are left out, so they rise despite the, you know, impediments?
Yeah, you know, gosh, I wish
I only realized that I went to an all-women's college and it had never had a woman for a president. I mean, isn't that absurd? But no one ever protested then, did they? I mean, it's just weird.
Yeah, I wish that I were the curator in women's history to be able to properly, I don't know if we're having some hearing issues, okay, to be able to properly address that question. I think it's a great question. I'd love to ensure that our curators, our director, our acting director as well, have an opportunity to address it. I don't think I'm aptly positioned to best address that question.
Who is?
It's a great question. It would be, you know, our curators, our scholars, our historians for sure.
Is it possible, possibly to the curators and scholars that you're working with, so with them?
In time, sure. As again, the museum is still very much in its starting phase, operationally.
Do you have any more sense of guidance on timeline? For example, when is Congress going to be asked on the site selection? And how do the current folks involved in either of the two museums have any preferences for which ones they would prefer?
So we continue to I can't imagine to predict Congress's timeline. I will leave that to them. We continue to obviously engage with them and have conversations with them, but I'm unable to really predict and project.
Could you discuss a little bit more detail? What are the advantages and disadvantages of the two sites?
Sure. Obviously, in both cases, one of the biggest advantages is the sheer location of it. Proximity to the National Mall, proximity to other Smithsonian museums. A visitor comes, they're able to kind of visit all of them kind of in one swoop, if you will. You know, both of the locations afford for an opportunity to build up, if you will, to build from, as opposed to a building that might already exist, that then you have to kind of conform to what's the existing structure, what you can do, what you can't do, what you might be able to move, what you might be able to not move. Both of those buildings afford, both of those plot of lands, if you will, afford an opportunity to kind of start from scratch. Again, pluses and minuses. I can't stress enough how there's no perfect location. Additionally, so I think both of the plots of land have the support from different folks. We heard from a lot of stakeholders. We did a lot of focus groups. We did a lot of surveys. I think some of you all kindly did some of our surveys and did some of our focus groups as well, just to kind of hear what they thought, what they said. And there was support for kind of both of these elements of location and proximity to National Mall, also the ability to be able to build from scratch. And I have a 12:30 hard stop, so I'm just gonna maybe if just one more question. I see Connie has her hand up. I'm happy to address that. And then after that, I can't thank you enough. Connie? I'm sorry, you're muted.
It's been so nice to have you and to hear about this. This is a dream we've had for a long time. I was horrified to learn that there was a fire and that destroyed pieces of history, and wondered if you guys are soliciting more and how you do that.
Just to be clear, that the fire was in the museum that the new director is coming from, not in any of our.
Okay.
Yeah, no. Just, no.
Jeez.
No, that would be a
Shut
bad
down
headline.
before we start.
No. That the new director, the museum from which she's coming from, experienced a fire in January 2020, and so had to kind of do a little bit of rebuilding, which, as I indicated, is somewhat analogous into some way of someone having to build something. Right. Just for clarity.
And how, do you have any idea how you're going to solicit materials from people? Because I think there's a lot of hidden treasures in people's attics. Now, there's a lot of junk too, but there's a lot of hidden treasures.
No, I think that's, the secretary outlines in his book, what he did was kind of similar to, kind of like Antique Roadshow, if you will, where he invited members of the community to share some of the treasures that they might have in their homes. And to your point, you'd be amazed what people might have that are not even so much of value, but just really contribute to powerful storytelling and objects. And it was something that he truly believed in and saw the value in. And it's an important point you raised.
We're very lucky to have Lonnie Bunch.
I agree. He's been terrific. And so, as you can imagine, he's really invested in these two new museums. And it's, this is exciting for him, as you can imagine. I don't think he thought, from build another opportunity to be part of two new museums. So yes, thank you very much. On that note, I will really thank you so much for your time. I appreciate the kind invitation. I enjoyed our chat last time, and I most certainly enjoyed our chat this time.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. Jennifer, your turn now.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here. Sue, thank you for inviting us. So I'm Jennifer Herrera, and I'm the Vice President of External Affairs for the National Women's History Museum. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with our museum. I'm guessing that a lot of you have heard of us and even maybe supported us over the many years. A little background, if you don't know, and we did do a presentation, I guess, 2 years ago, I think, pandemic time. So we began in 1996, and our goal was to see a museum. Our initial goal was to see a museum on the National Mall. And so with the help of really supporters and members from across the country, we fought for over 20 years to realize this vision, and including funding the commission, the Congressional Commission that was tasked to study whether there should be a museum on the National Mall dedicated to women's history. Of course, they needed this study to confirm what we already knew, but it was a great source of pride for us as an institution to spearhead this Congressional Commission through the funding and the support that we were able to get from our members. And so we are really excited. Ultimately, like our initial dream has been realized with what the Smithsonian is now being tasked to do by Congress, which is to build a museum on the National Mall. So I think that we were really key players, not just as an organization, but really the support, the long-term support of our charter members who continue to make the case for this museum, the need for this museum to exist. And what has been profoundly important to us as an institution, as we lobbied for this museum to come on the National Mall, we knew that people needed access to women's history outside of the walls of a museum in Washington, D.C. So it was a twofold track for us. And that's where we really started developing a museum without walls. And that is what is womenshistory.org right now. And we're very proud to be not just a museum without walls, but really the nation's largest cultural institution for women's history. We are so proud that we reach so many people, not just across the United States, but across the entire globe, with access that is immediately available to users across the world, so that there's never a barrier. There's no cost barrier to accessing women's history and ensuring that it's part of their lives, part of their knowledge base, and that includes educators. So another thing, we did a study in 2017 that you might be familiar with. It's called Where Are the Women? And it looked at women's representation in state social studies standards. And there were many key takeaways from this. We found that women were largely like individual women were celebrated. Think Susan B. Anthony, Amelia Earhart, et cetera. These kind of key figures you may know from history class, the few women that are taught. But for every 3 men that are discussed in our nation's classrooms, in our nation's history books, I should say, only 1 woman is discussed. So we really wanted to change that. And that's a big part of what we do. We want to make sure that educators who we know are very hungry for this information and want to teach it have the tools to incorporate it in their classrooms, but also that learners of all ages can come to visit us anytime they want. So we are at a very exciting place in our own history where we are starting on a really exciting new model to expand where we bring these virtual programs. Of course, we bring them all over the world, but we really want to make sure that we can bring women's history to communities across the country in person as well. So we're thrilled to share that on March 30th, we're opening our first in-person interactive exhibition. It's a really amazing, inspiring exhibition called We Who Believe in Freedom, Black Feminist DC. And that is opening at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library on Thursday, March 30th at 5 p.m. I can put a link in the chat because I do hope you'll join us for our official ribbon cutting and grand opening celebration. But this exhibition kicks off our partnership with, it kicks off our new model of partnerships with other cultural institutions to bring women's history across the country. So we are very, very interested in exploring local women's history and telling the stories of local women and engaging the community through like-missioned collaborations. So we're starting off with, as I said, at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library. This is a part of a partnership we're doing with DC Public Library. And so we are bringing this exhibition to the MLK Library. To be very clear, this is not a traveling exhibition. We're not going to take this one exhibition across the United States. We are going to help uncover and amplify and share local women's history based on this model of community partnerships. This first exhibit is so inspiring. It really showcases the tenacious work of Black feminists. Until we focus a lot on the civil rights movement and Black power movements until today. and the pre-civil rights movements as well. But we are so excited because their stories and their work, while very place-based in Washington, D.C., had such profound ripple effects across the country. And we're excited to bring that to the MLK Library in just a week and a half. a little daunting. And so while we continue to do these partnerships, we're very excited to still reach, over 5 million people on our website each year and through our wonderful in-person programs that we are gearing back up to do. We've done some already. We are consultants on the American Women Quarters program with the United States Mint. So we're proud to even now be going from community to community, celebrating the women that are featured on the quarters. So that's kind of us right now in a nutshell. I'd love to take your questions and talk with you about women's history and the future of our work as we move into this new model.
That's great. I'll ask the first question. Since you have a global reach as far as all the people that can communicate with you, I was wondering what you are doing as far as content. Are you trying to cover women's history globally, or is it primarily American, US women's history?
It is primarily American women's history, but that is not a hard and fast rule. We do incorporate women outside of the United States as well, but it is primarily American women's history. I'll give you a quick example. When COVID happened, we knew that women were going to be disproportionately affected, and really social scientists were predicting that, as many others were, and it turned out to be absolutely spot on. And we started a wonderful initiative called Women Writing History, Coronavirus Journaling Project. And we work to ensure that women's stories and experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic were recorded, contemporary women's stories. We didn't want their voices to be lost, especially because they were going to be disproportionately affected. And we now have a website where we host hundreds and hundreds of journals from women across the country, but also internationally, of women who've shared their stories. And it's a really powerful collection of stories. We asked people to journal in a way that was meaningful to them, whether that was a physical journal, whether it was photography or videos or podcasts or whatever way was meaningful to them. And so it's such a fascinating look at this shared experience we all went through. And so I mentioned that because it's a deeply moving experience to go read and experience some of these journals, but also we really wanted to get an international perspective, and we invited women from outside of the United States to participate as well.
And let me just ask one other question and open it up for others. One of the concerns that we've all had over the years is the coordination or lack thereof of coordination between the National Women's History Museum, yours, and the Smithsonian's American Women's History Museum. For example, do you have any representatives on the Smithsonian Advisory Board? And have there been any informal discussions about how the two museums may work together?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of things. First, we do have 2 members of our board sit on their advisory council. So we're very proud to have our museum represented on that council as well. So that was part of the legislation when that Congress passed with this new museum So we're thrilled. Singleton McAllister and Catherine Algor are our two representatives on their board. We do work closely with them a lot. We are in the same circles often, as you may know, including on the American Women Quarters program. So we are definitely, they're very new to building the museum. Obviously, they're just getting started with that. And we look forward to continuing to collaborate with them. And we do often, we do often.
Other folks, questions, comments?
Patricia?
Pat, you're muted. Unmute.
Yeah, I've unmuted. I'm a charter member. I've been, I think, a supporter since this enterprise started off. And basically my question is pretty much the same as the last person's final question. Because I've always been surprised that there is no mention of the other museum from either one's side. I mean, from the National Women's History Museum, I haven't seen any explanation in any of the materials about the Smithsonian Museum, nor have I seen anything from the Smithsonian that relates to the pre-existing museum. So I was wondering how, what kind of real relationship is there, and how did this happen that the National Women's History Museum initiative kind of got run over in a way. So
well, first of all, Patricia, thank you for being a charter member. And my screen, I was looking one way and you scooted over. Thank you for your support and for being a charter member. We are still kind of, very honestly, we're figuring out how to I wouldn't say define each institution, because we're both very well defined, but we know that there's a lot of confusion in the public eye about both entities. The Smithsonian, we are working very closely on how we both, publicly differentiate ourselves, I should say. So stay tuned. This is not trying to keep anything hidden or not be transparent. We're just figuring this out collaboratively. So we will share that. For instance, the new the American Women's History Museum just launched their new website, which is exciting. I'm working with their head of comms often, so we connect on language, and know that not only do we have our board representatives on their board, but our leadership team works very closely with the Smithsonian leadership team. We have a really collaborative relationship, and we're both in this, we're in our new chapter. I wish the Smithsonian was able to stay on longer to address this on their end as well, but we are proud to collaborate with them and serve in this space together. It's funny to me just how women's history has been so underrepresented. As I mentioned earlier, the need for a congressional commission to study whether there should be a museum is maddening to begin with. But we ultimately want to share and amplify these stories. And we are very excited that this new museum is going to do that, and that we can still reach our goals outside of building a museum. How we did not, for lack of a better word, get the museum. This is Congress, right? Congress has decided after they did the commission that this should be a Smithsonian museum. And when you think about, that's not entirely surprising, considering the Smithsonian museums line our national mall. So it would make sense that Congress would say this, designate this as a Smithsonian museum. But we're really excited about it. We're excited to continue to do what we're doing. We're excited to reach people outside of Washington, D.C. So we'll kind of see how it unfolds, but we'll be there, you know, with bells on.
Could you tell us more about your local women's history initiatives and how you're trying to make that happen? I think that's very creative.
I'm sorry, I'm hearing some feedback.
Sorry.
Okay, can you repeat that, Susan?
Sure. To talk more about your initiatives on local women's history, sort of taking off after the DC feminist exhibit. How are you planning to generate that, support that, encourage that throughout?
Yeah, well, we have many different stakeholders. We have our Scholars Advisory Committee, we have exhibition committees, we have our leadership team and our staff and our board. So really, we're getting through this first one, which is so exciting and a really massive undertaking. But we knew at our core that we wanted to do this model where it's not necessarily this national story, but what is meaningful to a particular community? What are the stories that haven't been told as much? So we're laser focused right now on our first exhibition, but come actually April, we're really going to start looking into what is our next city? What are the stories we want to tell in those cities? What are the possibilities? And really, we want to hear from the communities. We want to hear from the places where we're exploring, like what is important to the communities. So we're going to do a lot of listening and a lot of research and make sure that we can do right by whatever our next topic is. So it will be a longer process, as you know, for each of these cities, because there's a lot of due diligence involved, but we're really ready to dive headfirst into exploring our options.
And talking about the opening of your new exhibit, the announcements all say it opens at 5 p.m. on March 30th at the Martin Luther King Library. Should we all try to get there at 5 p.m. or do you think it's going to be overcrowded, and should we pace our participation and viewing of the exhibit for later on?
Well, I will say we have hundreds of RSVPs, so it will be a really wonderful big event. The library is huge. I don't know if you've been there, but it's massive, and we are really just over the moon to have this exhibit open there. If 5 p.m. is when remarks start. And so we're going to have remarks, we're going to have a performance, we're going to have community organizations there. And really the program, so to speak, starts at 5. So if you do want to be there for part of the program, please join us at 5. But no, this exhibit's going to be there until fall 2024. So you have plenty of time if a grand opening event is not for you and you don't want to brave the crowds. We totally understand. We do hope that you check it out another day, maybe when it's a little more quiet. By the way, the very next night, we are bringing back our Women Making History Awards Gala, and we are very excited to have this happen again after a 3-year hiatus due to the pandemic. And one of the women we're honoring, these are such inspiring events. I love them and I've missed them. One of the women we're honoring, her name is Willie Pearl Mackey King, and she was unrelated to Martin Luther King Jr., but she served as his executive assistant, and she actually transcribed what became Letter from Birmingham jail.
Yeah.
On notes, and like notes he would write on trashes and pieces of trash, and slips of paper and other really small little things that would get smuggled out of jail. So we're very excited to have her as one of our honorees this year. Connie, I see your hand raised.
Yes, I was wondering, I'm thinking since you're a private institution.
Yeah.
It is perhaps easier for you to handle controversial topics. And maybe that's going to be the niche where the Smithsonian might have to maintain a more neutral attitude because of their federal funding and the fact that they're federal employees. They may be able to handle some of those. I'm looking forward to it. I'm a charter member also, and I'm looking forward to it. I just did my ticket and I hope to be there on the 30th.
Oh, Connie, thank you so much.
And I'll bring my annual donation.
Thank you very, very much. I think what's really interesting, and I think this might be one way to consider, we've over the years, over the nearly 30 years we've been in existence, we've really worked to share women's stories. We are a storytelling based institution, and we know that stories from the past will inform our future. And so the Smithsonian plays a very critical role as an object collecting institution. And they are going to have phenomenal stuff, for lack of a better word, in their museum. But as a storytelling institution, we are able to be really nimble and inventive in what we do, because we do have a very small collection, right? It's mostly a collection of stories and histories that we share. So I think that to your point, Connie, we are eager to take on controversial topics. We are, as a private institution, we have a lot of freedom and we have a lot of leeway, also rooted in scholarship. That's really important. And, we have such a fantastic curatorial team of advisors and scholars that we're really proud to have as stakeholders in our work. But yes, we were, for instance, when Dobbs came down, we immediately put together a virtual program on the history of abortion rights in the United States. So these topics, we can be really nimble. And also, it's important to us to share contemporary women's history and stories and what is happening now. We don't want to ever have to play catch up again, to be in a place where we are always making up for all this lost time that we've all felt over a very long period of time of women's stories being absent.
Jennifer, I think Denise has a question for you. And also at some point, if there's a chance, can you put up those quarters again? Because I've never.
Oh, yes, I will show you, Denise, I will show you that, and or I'll take your question in a second. So these are the quarters. This was the 2022 series. My Sally ride popped out. That is probably due to my child popping it out, who's a little numismatist. But we have the first series, Maya Angelou, Sally Ride, Wilma Mankiller, Nina Otero Warren, and Anna Mae Wong. This year's series just kicked off with Bessie Coleman. We were in Chicago actually for the Bessie Coleman coin event with the DuSable Museum out there. And then we'll also have Edith Kanaka Ole. We'll have Eleanor Roosevelt, Hovita Idar, and Maria Tallchief this year in this series. So I hope you're looking in your pockets for these women. And what's been really rewarding about this program, first of all, we helped, we recommended the women on the quarters, that they were selected by Secretary Yellen. But we have big names like Maya Angelou and Eleanor Roosevelt, but what to me is really exciting about this coin program is sharing the stories of the women who you've never heard of. And when you look in your pocket and you see Nina Otero Warren, you might say, like, who is she? And to learn the story of suffrage in the Southwest and what she did for women's right to vote, or Wilma Mankiller is the first principal chief of female principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. It's just really cool, this program. So please look for them in your change. You can order them on themint.com, by the way, or you can go to your bank. One thing one of my sons and I like to do is go just get some quarter rolls and then have a little scavenger hunt and see who pops up. So really, really exciting program. Denise, where are you?
I'm right here. Thank you.
Hi, Denise.
I really appreciate your updating us on what you've been doing. I've actually followed your museum since its inception when I worked with the late C. Dolores Tucker. So congratulations. And I'm curious about the new chapter that you're doing and your new exhibition.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, could you give us a vision of where you see the museum in 5 or 10 years? Are you going to be doing collections or building out the partnerships? So this is very exciting because I'm of the theory that there's so little women's history told. We need 1,000 flowers. More history everywhere. So
100%.
kudos, and I just would love to see where you see yourself going.
Thank you, Denise. Yes, 100%. And that's, gosh, I mean, we're going to be really fortunate to have not just the American Women's History Museum opening up, but the Women in the Arts is reopening soon. So I can't wait to go over there in DC. Where we see ourselves in 5 years is with, I can't give you a number of cities that we'll have been in 5 years, because it does take a lot of work to bring an exhibition to life. But I would say a few more exhibitions across the country in the next 5 years, but really continuing to build a coalition that is dedicated to amplifying women's voices and contributions. And how can we leverage those partnerships, not just through a single exhibition in this city or that city, but by really helping excavate women's history and amplifying women's history in collaboration, in some of these key collaborations. For instance, one of our newest coalition members is a group called Legends of the Ball. And they are a fantastic group that advocates for women in sports. They were trailblazing women's basketball players, and their work is incredible. And so how could we partner with them on some of our sports related activity programs? We're doing an exhibition, a virtual exhibition on Title IX coming up soon, actually. So really, we want to, this is a long answer, but really we want to bring these exhibitions to cities across the country. We want to deepen our connection with other partners, and whether that's through, education partners or other like-missioned organizations, and then simultaneously continue to make sure that we are developing resources for learners of all ages and educators. I did a Twitter chat last night with the National Council of History Educators, and it was so wonderful to see how educators are incorporating women's history into the classroom. So one of our long-term goals is to continue to make sure educators have this information readily accessible, and what tools do we need to support them? Because at the end of the day, fundamentally, we need to ensure that women are included in our national narrative. And that includes, the walls of a museum, that includes public sculpture and the halls of Congress, but it really starts with the books our kids open. And so we really want to make sure that educators and students can continue to access this, and that they know about it, and that they share this history. How do we empower people to share these stories themselves?
Thank you so much. That was really inspiring. And now we're ready to learn about local DC area attractions and many other women's history resources from our wonderful treasurer, Hallie Joseph. Hallie,
Yeah, thank you. I gotta say, there's another important point, and that Jennifer just alluded to, that it's up to all of us to promote this. And I was thinking about, just because I had a few times when I said, oh, we can all remedy this, we can all chip in this, but just because I want to piggyback on what you said, there are so many women that many people don't even know about. I'm thinking we're doing this because of Women's History Month, but we really should have Women a Week. A woman just to educate people that 52 at the end of the year that you didn't know before. And so anyway, I put in a couple lists, and there are many lists of places to go, and you could do the same thing. You could take one tour a week if you wanted to, and be ever so much educated on women's history. But I just particularly wanted to speak with two that I'm interested to find out how many people have been to what is now called the Belmont Hall House, that had been the Sewell Belmont House that's next to this Senate office building, because I think it's pretty remote. And I will warn you that you can't go right now because it's under construction. But it's also where Alice Paul lived for a good part of her life. And so that's what I was going to mention, but because it's so convenient, as is the Capitol. So I was going to just mention those two things right away. But the point I want to, a larger point is there's so much to know, and there's so, and though we focused on federal or things in this district, there are so many things that are not here. And so we got to take advantage of those remotely, but never stop the, give up the energy to pursue those. But okay, I mentioned about Alice Paul, and I just wanted to tell you that got to get on my glasses to be able to tell you this. Okay, this is okay. Here we go. It is. I warned you that it was closed for a massive renovation, but it's one of the oldest. Sorry, one of the oldest. The Sewell Belmont House I'm talking about, Belmont Hall now, is one of the oldest remaining houses in the Capitol area. And it was historical significance because it predated women's activism as the headquarters of the National Women's Party, founded by Alice Paul, where she lived until 1972. And by Ellie Smeal's account, it was where women, after the Equal Rights Amendment passed out of Congress for the first time, in 1923, they went up to celebrate with Alice Paul, and she couldn't be found because she was so upset about the time limit being imposed on it. She said it will never pass. And so far she's right, sadly enough. But anyway, and she never obviously lived to see the Equal Rights Amendment. And I think we got to keep that in mind to get our energy never dissipating on this. Okay. And then if you walk to the Capitol, you can see many tributes to women, but again, not nearly enough, because there are so many more spaces that were taken by men again. And I'm got this information from the most recent Women's History, the magazine of the National Women's History Alliance. And there are currently 266 sculptures in the Capitol, but no more than 5% are of women. And but I've got to point out, as you probably well know, that some of the favored men are going to be replaced by women. In fact, there was a story of Robert E. Lee being replaced by, do you know who it is? Barbara Johns, a high school student who fought in the Civil, what did I say? She didn't fight in the Civil War. She fought way more recently than the Civil War, but in the civil rights movement. And so it's kind of exciting that a high school student would be recognized. So, but in Statuary Hall, there are 11 women. Now, I've got to read these. This is an instruction for you. Mary McLeod Bethune, Amelia Earhart, Mother Joseph. Now, Mother Joseph is of interest to me because I could be Mother Joseph. And I don't know her at all, but I'm going to pursue her. Helen Keller, Esther Hobart Morris, Jeanette Rankin, Dr. Florence Sabin, Sacagawea, Maria Sanford, Frances Willard, and Sarah Winnemucca. So this is to point out how much we may decry how many people are unacknowledged, but there are so many unacknowledged and unattributed people in women's history. And we can't forget that as a really a main fact. And and another point I want to make is that somewhere we should rectify that there's a lot of women's history in some of the men's tributes. For example, I thought of this. When you go to the Lincoln Memorial, who there tells you that Marian Anderson sang there, you know, when she wasn't able to sing in the DAR home? Or the site of my own wedding, these many years ago, the Jefferson Memorial, where do you learn that he wasn't married, but he had a partner, Sally Hemings, who should be recognized there, I think. So this is a counter presentation for you in women's history a little bit. And or how about, yeah, oh, I did, point out about the Marian Anderson sang at the Lincoln Memorial because of Eleanor Roosevelt's intervention. So, I mean, there are so many unattributed parts. Now, let me make another, okay. All right, that's kind of what I wanted to say, except, and you'll, in the list that you get on the summary of this program will be my list. There are a number of people who've written walking tours, and I've put them on. There's also another book that I have. I was going to hold it up, but I couldn't find it. But it's 111 places in women's history in Washington, D.C. that you must not miss. Now, who would know that there were 111? So it would kind of indicate that you couldn't step out, of the take two steps in the District of Columbia without seeing a relevant, history, women's history opportunity. Let's see. I already brought this point up. I thought, as we're studying women's history, how much do we recognize the unfairness of our history toward women? And that, shouldn't escape our attention. The reason, okay, let's just point out my sign in the background, how much our history would be different if we had passed the ERA years ago. How much would Title IX have been so necessary? I mean, these things, and you can't even evaluate them really. But I haven't heard that enough discussion about it even. But anyway, the point is, I got an email today saying we have to know about climate changing, the issue of climate change, that word is climate change, affecting disadvantaging women disproportionately, must not go unrecognized. So anyway, our job is ahead of us. But more than that, I wanted to say we focused on the things in DC and really federal things. There are so many things. I see Jill Moss Greenberg, who helped with the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. And I know because I was there recently, it's in Baltimore, and she had a lot to do with starting it. So there are a lot of things at the state level and local level that we should know about too. But anyway, Diana, what's her name? I hate this. This is pandemic. But Diana, she just wrote Diana Bailey just wrote me to say that organization is part of Projects and Partners, an organization of different women's organizations and opportunities all over the country. So who would know? Did anyone know of that? I didn't. Probably Jennifer and people do. But anyway, the point is that there are many things, and we may be able to see them in person soon again. So great subject, great, worthy of our time and worthy of our pursuit. Thanks. Yeah. Did anyone have any questions or want to add anything? Because I kept thinking, people will know more than I do about this. But share your thoughts. Jennifer, did you?
That was excellent. I was thinking of two things while you were talking. One, I don't know if everybody knows about the the Women's Suffrage National Monument Foundation. They're working to build a suffrage monument, which is really exciting in Washington, D.C. And then the other thing to supplement what you were saying, and oh my gosh, Belmont Hall is such an inspiring place to be. I loved going there. But one of our partners is A Tour of Her Own, and it really looks at women's history sites around DC. And I hope you can check them out because they do a lot of virtual presentations, but also in-person tours of important sites for women's history. So they're a great resource.
Well, let me say I'd shoot myself if I didn't bring this up, and you remind me, so I'm very grateful. But our local Now chapter had a presentation by a young woman whose name I can't remember. Ray's is her first name, but she started a whole effort to bring a memorial to the Rosie the Riveters, and we should all pursue that because it's so interesting. And this was her whole project in DC that got a whole interest, and they raised money and they're going to pursue it. It's really something. So, and follow Rosie the Riveters for a real women's history adventure. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me at all?
Yes, Jill. I'm so glad. Yes.
Hi, Holly. Thank you very much for mentioning the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. And Jennifer, if you haven't been there yet, go and visit. I don't live in the DC area anymore, but I'm still very involved with all of it and still on the board of the Heritage Center. As far as we know, and the National Women's History Alliance acknowledges the Maryland Women's Heritage Center as the first community-based women's history museum and center. And that's been very important that it was multicultural and diverse from the beginning. So everyone come to Baltimore too. But I did want to mention one aspect. The women behind the scenes. I am now, as some of you know, living in Florida, not happily, but however, we were able to get Mary McLeod Bethune's statue into the Statuary Hall. That was huge. And she replaced, as some of you know, a Confederate general, male, white. And it was a huge victory to have her statue in there. But I want to add and to think about for all of us, but Jennifer in particular, for the lens of your museum, is that the sculptor who did the Mary McLeod Bethune statue that's in Statuary Hall was the first woman, the first Latina to actually carve one of the statues that's in Statuary Hall and in the Capitol. And so again, as we're looking at the unsung heroines and the women behind so many things, let's not just look at Mary McLeod Bethune, who was extraordinary, but also let's also look at the sculptor who did the statue, who was amazing. We got to meet her here several times in the process. And I think, again, that we don't fall into the same trap of only looking at the stars, but looking at the community-based people, the people who've done the work or the creation of things.
Yes, that's great. And again, it goes back to the importance of acknowledging Rosie, all the Riveters, because they took over.
Right.
Just because there was an absence of men. So our theme should be the same. We can do it, right? Yeah. Thanks so much, Jill. Thanks.
Welcome.
Holly, can I add one more thing? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's the point. We can all do it. Just
okay. I don't want to take up too much time.
I hope everyone's going to think about this later too.
I wanted to share this really cool story. When you were talking about the sculptor, Jill, you reminded me of the coins. So on the obverse, I think at the obverse, it's an updated portrait of George Washington. And a woman had originally created the George Washington portrait for the quarter. And then her design was not selected. A man's design was chosen by Secretary Mellon. So even though I think she had, if I'm correct, she had won a competition or her design was really popular, and then wasn't ultimately selected. But for this new quarter series, the sculptor, she was one of the most prolific female sculptors in the early 20th century. Her name is Laura Garden Fraser, and her design is the design that came back for the quarters. So I just loved what you said, Jill. So I had to chime in because I think it's so cool that not only are we honoring women through this coin series, but how important it is that you look at, like, here's a woman from the early 20th century who was really prolific, and her design was overlooked then, but no longer. So another little piece of cool history about these.
Well, and that leads to the issue of there was a real pursuit of getting Harriet Tubman on a coin. And I fear that effort may have died with the person who was most pursuing it, who died suddenly, Linda Mahoney, who's worked so hard on that and other things through now in Maryland Women's Heritage Center. So
I actually have an update on that too.
all the better.
It was actually the $20 bill, or at least maybe we're talking two different things, but I know that there was a push. Inside the government, inside Treasury, Rosie Rios, the treasurer under President Obama, really spearheaded the efforts to get Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. And I know the Biden administration is still pursuing that right now. It's important. However, in a conversation I had with the treasurer for our magazine, she said that this is, to her understanding, it's still in the queue, so to speak, to get Harriet Tubman on that 20. We need a woman on currency on our bills, not just our coins, but really everywhere. But she said it's a matter of national security because they have to redesign the $10 note first, and then and not Harriet Tubman on the bill being a national security. The redesigning of bills is a national security issue. So they're starting with the 10, and then there's an order to them. And so I share this because I don't want you to think Harriet Tubman was forgotten. That is still very much in play, but they have to start with the $10 note first and then move on.
But you think the effort is still going strong?
I think it's still going strong for sure. And
right,
anytime you can champion it in your own ways to keep it out there, that would be incredible.
Can I tell you one thing about the Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill? Some of you know there are stamps available of Harriet Tubman's face. You can stamp onto your $20 bills. It's perfectly legal to do. We've done it here in Florida. We had an event with several hundred people celebrating the suffrage anniversary 2 years later because of COVID. But we had the stamps available and people stamped their $20 bills. And they are in circulation down here. It's completely legal to do. And I encourage people to do that so that as you use $20 bills, her face will be there and keep reminding and creating awareness.
Wow. Great idea. Oh, great. So.
Connie, did you want to unmute and tell us something?
Say what? Please.
I don't see how that can't be considered defacing US currency. And
It's
that's
actually, Connie, we got a legal opinion on it and it is legal.
amazing. I didn't see when I was in Florida recently. I didn't see any. Okay. Maybe they haven't hit Tampa. Huh.
Yeah, well, they are in our area.
Great. Does anyone else have anything to add? Okay, well, yeah. Keep your ideas coming. Oh, Connie, you're muted. Go ahead.
Holly, I'm going to circulate your notes to the people. I have an email list of everybody and I can circulate it to the
Okay.
people today. Okay.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for your participation in this great discussion and program.
Let me just mention our next CWI meeting. We're planning to have it on April 25th. And we're hoping to arrange for Kimberly Crenshaw to be one of our guest presenters. Kim is, of course, the main originator of the whole theory of intersectionality, and she played a major role in critical race theory, and she has a lot of insights on how we can fight the diversity, equity, and inclusion opponents. I think that's particularly important as a person who's worked a lot with Title IX and higher ed institutions. The Title IX coordinator often is situated in the DEI office, and DeSantis in Florida has, and the Florida legislature has recommended getting rid of all of those offices in institutions of higher ed and other even businesses. So we are looking forward to her presentation. It hasn't been definitely confirmed, but it looks very promising. So we'll keep you posted on that. Any other questions? And thank you so much to Jennifer and Holly for your presentations.
And Julissa.
Thank you so much for having us. This was delightful to talk with you all. Thank you.
Connie? Connie, you were saying something?
Oh, no, I was just saying, don't forget Julissa, but we already thanked her. It was great having you. We're looking forward to next time. I hope it's going to be a really enlightening discussion of how it is we've reached this nadir of self critique and other critique, and how do we work ourselves out of this corner that we've been shoved into, we who believe in the more liberal things. So I hope that's going to be a good discussion next month. And with that, I will say goodbye if there's nothing else.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.